Newsroom. Here in the French capital, Sweden has good press these days. What with Malmaison's Zlatan Ibrahimovic scoring a league-best 30 goals, leading Paris Saint-Germain to its first title in a decade and a half. But Sweden has also been making headlines for all the wrong reasons, with riots in the working-class suburbs of Stockholm. Riots involving an often alienated immigrant population. Now that flies in the face of popular wisdom on that country, one of the Nordic nations, hailed as an example, and not just by The Economist. Ever since the crisis struck, the whole world has been looking at the poster child for state-sponsored social democracy for Qs, on how to rein in banks, how to fuel a recovery. Times have changed, though. Out with the so-called third way between capitalism and socialism. In with cost-cutting these past years. Less government coupled with lots of immigration, putting a strain on the social fabric, it seems, and playing into the hands of a far right that's made historic inroads in that country. So what are the lessons we can learn from this nation? Today in the France 24 debate, is it the death of the Swedish model? And with us to talk about it is France 24's very own Sarah Bertelsen. Welcome to the debate. Welcome as well to the Finance Minister of Chile, Felipe Larraín. Also with us, Sunny Kapoor, Managing Director of Redefine. Both of you gentlemen here participating in the OECD Forum, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. And thank you for swinging by our studios. The France 24 debate, where you can always join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, our hashtag F24debate. Now, we are back to normal. Those are the words of the Stockholm police spokesperson this Tuesday. For more than a week, though, the Swedish capital has been living under the shadow of nightly riots. It all started May the 19th in the Stockholm suburb of Husby, where 80% of the residents are immigrants.
Sweden is not used to seeing this kind of scene on its streets. Yet it's become a common sight in parts of the capital, Stockholm. Rioters have attacked cars, public buildings, and even emergency service workers. A poster child for social democracy, Sweden is well known for its openness, tolerance, and welfare state. But things have changed over the last 20 years, with increased competition and government spending cuts. State benefits have been reduced and local authority budgets squeezed, while at the same time, immigration has been on the rise. Last year, nearly 44,000 asylum seekers arrived in the country, a 50% jump on the year before. More than half had come from Syria, Afghanistan and Somalia. Many found themselves living on deprived estates on the outskirts of Stockholm, where the unemployment rate stands higher than the national average. Last year, the number of jobless in the district of Husby was 8.8%, while in the capital, just a 20-minute train ride away, that figure was 3.6%.
People here feel many times like they are not listened to, especially youth feel that way, like we don't have the same opportunities here as we see in other places.
And that's not the only contrast. Unemployment among those born outside Sweden is almost 3 times higher than among native-born Swedes. Among the worst affected are young people. A recent study showed that up to a third of 16 to 29-year-olds living in deprived parts of Swedish cities were neither in education, employment or training. In Husby, almost half the children of high school age don't have the level of education required to attend class.
In many of these neighborhoods, the kids, the youth, don't have the same opportunities. And a lot of them have not finished school and don't have an education. And we all know that without an education, it's really hard to get a job.
The rioting was triggered by the death of a 69-year-old Portuguese immigrant earlier this month. He was shot by police in Husby, suspected of wielding a knife. The immigrant community has accused the police of racism and heavy-handedness, and it's that, along with the high unemployment rate, that has fueled the rioting. Out of the 34 members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, Sweden's rich-poor divide increased more than any other countries between 1995 and 2010.
All right, that report by Kate Williams. We're pleased to introduce, before we begin our discussion, a fourth guest, Bruce Stokes, coming in. Bruce Stokes of the Pew Research Center, who also taking part in that OECD forum. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Sorry I'm late.
Paris traffic.
Absolutely.
First question to Sarah Bertelsen. Sarah, again, what we just saw in that report flies in the face of what we imagine to be Sweden. Is something broken there?
I think maybe the image we have, or certainly the image from the abroad of Sweden, has been a bit distorted the last couple of years. Maybe it's not the same Sweden today as it was 20 years ago. And I think that Sweden isn't broken, but maybe we're not looking at Sweden with the right glasses anymore. We need to clean them and look at Sweden. Sweden today, this is Sweden.
15% immigrant, foreign-born.
Yes, and we have neighborhoods, suburbs with very high youth unemployment, especially with high segregation, and especially a high alienation within the youth community. So Sweden has changed, and I think that the image of Sweden should change as well with it.
All right. So Sweden, where you go too often, Sunny Kapoor, were you surprised by what happened in the past week?
Well, yes and no. Given that unemployment rate and many of the migrant problems that you mentioned are actually much worse in many other countries where similar rioting is not taking place, it is strange to see this spontaneously break out in Sweden. And I think that was a bit surprising. But having lived in Norway and in Denmark and going to Sweden often, I mean, you do see the face of Sweden, which is not actually captured in the media headlines, what you were referring to, that it is facing many of the same challenges that societies are placing elsewhere, perhaps on a more moderate scale. But it is definitely not a perfect, harmonious society. Not that it ever was, but it is changing. And the big question I think we need to address is whether the Swedish model is scalable. I mean, what works for a population of 5 million or 8 million in Scandinavia may not necessarily be replicable in much more diverse society. So it's the scale, but it's also the diversity. Is it robust against a significant change in ethnic mix? Is it robust against a significant migration? Because the level of social...
And is the jury still out on that?
I think that what we're seeing is not particularly encouraging. And what has been quite interesting within the Euro crisis is many of the places like the Netherlands used to look like, at least from afar, as a post-racial, uber-liberal society that had arrived, at the pinnacle of civilization. And it is very interesting to see how even relatively small changes in economic prospects can reverse years and years of progress in terms of integration of migrants, in terms of social cohesion. And I think that we are realizing how fragile much of what we consider progress is, and the challenges we face are huge.
Bruce Stokes, the Pew Research Center, one of the things that you focus on a lot there is how attitudes change when you have, for instance, a change in the religious mix, a change in the ethnic mix. Listening to Sunny Kapoor, how do you think Sweden is faring?
Well, I think that the points of both speakers are what we need to focus on. This is not the Sweden of the 1950s or 1960s. This is a far less homogeneous society than I think we and the Swedes had also come to think of themselves. And there is a question about whether heterogeneous societies have that sense of reciprocal obligation. Yeah. That seem to bind together not only the Swedish model, but the Danish model and others. I think the disturbing conclusion could be that these things aren't scalable. Yeah. But since no other model seems to have worked as well as the old Swedish model or the old Danish model worked in terms of a sense of social cohesion and support, if we are not even left with a Swedish model, we seem to be modelless at this point. And we know from the most recent Pew survey that basically people don't think the system's working. They don't believe it's working in a macro sense for the economy, but they also don't think it's working for them personally. They think it's unfair. They think inequality has grown. If the approach of a Swedish model was going to be the answer to that, And if the Swedish model doesn't work, then we're all in much deeper trouble than we thought, I think.
All right, Felipe Lerain, you're not just a politician, you're also an academic. You've co-authored books with Jeffrey Sachs on the economy. When you hear the word Swedish model, what does it say to you?
Well, the Swedish model was, considered kind of a third way at a point where you could. It was not really sort of a completely market economy. It was not a socialist system. It was some kind of a mix with a lot of social cohesion. And certainly what we saw over the last, a decade or more was, that some parts of that Swedish model with very high tax rates was, being undone. And the economy started to grow. But then you get a problem with the social cohesion, which is beyond how you're doing economically, because at a particular point, you may have groups within the population that are not considered to be part of the benefits, or they're not considered to getting their share. And I just mentioned because in Chile, we have a special program. We talk about youth unemployment. And in this part of these immigrants, it's very high, much higher rates of growth of unemployment for them. In Chile, we have pretty much full employment at this time. We have 6.2%, which for us is about a full employment rate. But we have among the youth, those less than 25, 2.5 times this is normal, internationally, to have more unemployment among the young. And we have targeted particular programs. We have a subsidy for employment for the youth, not unemployment subsidy. This is for people who get a job, which are in the 60% most vulnerable part of the population. They get 20% of the minimum wage as a government subsidy. So it costs the government money, but we think it's a good program. And we have a special statute.
And yours, hold on, yours is a center-right government.
Yes.
And here you are touting the virtues of subsidies.
Well, of course, there are some subsidies which are good, and there are others which are wrong. So, it's not a matter of, religious belief on subsidies or not. We are a center-right government who would raise taxes to pay for part of the reconstruction of the earthquake, and we got an upgrade from all the international risk houses, the risk classification, and Chile got upgraded by the four major. After we raised taxes temporarily, some of them, a few of them permanent, to pay for two things, reconstruction and education. So I don't believe that a center-right government, cannot have subsidies and cannot raise taxes. You have to do it in a sensible way so that you don't kill the economy, and you are tending for those who are most at need in your society. We are of the belief that center-right or not, you cannot leave people out, of the benefits of society.
Can't leave people out in Sweden, and this is another myth that's perhaps been shattered these past years. We've touched upon it already. The idea that the nanny state is there forever. Public spending has dipped now to below the EU average. Public spending as a percentage of the nation's GDP. France, by the way, number 2 in the European Union, just behind Denmark. And there you see how Sweden is dropping and dropping fast. Now, that recently got the editor of The Economist's Schumpeter column, Adrian Wooldridge, crowing. He said, the streets of Stockholm are awash with the blood of sacred cows. The think tanks are brimful of new ideas. The erstwhile champion of the third way is now pursuing a far more interesting brand of politics. Well, that column got a rouse out of Aditya Chakraborty in today's Guardian. He wrote that when it comes to privatizing public services, Stockholm is way out in front of Westminster, which is why Education Secretary Michael Gove adores their free school and voucher system, and why George Osborne enjoys being photographed alongside his Swedish counterpart. Sarah Bertelsen, do Swedes themselves recognize themselves in the way that, well, it's taken a very free market turn?
Yes and no. I think that Swedes have, as quite often actually, Swedes love change in one way. The country was built upon the idea of, or the modern Sweden at least, was built upon the idea of that change is good. And so I believe in the change in politics, and I believe that the Swedish model that we see today is a rupture with the Swedish model that we saw built in the 50s. It's a Swedish model, but it's not at all the same model as we had in the 50s. And so people, yes, they accept and they like the idea of change, but I don't think they realize just how extreme these changes actually are. I mean, the liberalism in Sweden today, you mentioned the school system, for example, it's a voucher system that would not be imaginable, not in the US, not in France, and I don't think in the UK either.
And is it popular?
It has... I think that people just accepted the way that this is the way it is now. There are critics, but it's more like it will be reformed, but I don't hear very much talk about the system being actually withdrawn or that we should go back to the old system the way it was. Swedes, in some way, adapt quite quickly to changes in society.
What triggered this pendulum swing?
Well, I think it's you know the story of drop a frog in boiling water and it'll jump out, and you slow boil the frog and it wouldn't quite realize. And I think that's been going on in Sweden. It's a combination of what has been incremental changes, none of which in itself were big enough, but which have really accumulated over time. Plus, there was at least a partial rupture when the center-right government that is in power came to power. And in fact, there's an interesting trend that there's something similar happening in Norway now, where there's an election due in September, and the center-right there is hoping to win after 2 terms of social democracy, and they are not particularly referring to any policies. You know, it's just about we'll do as the Swedes did, just a little bit better, etc. And the Swedish government, what it has actually done since it came in, is significantly more radical than what it had let on before the election and what was kind of part of its electoral program. And this has really, really added up. And I think that the riots, amongst other things, will make the Swedes think how far they have come. And I wouldn't be surprised if there were a significant momentum that built up. I think what you were saying, if a debate actually started, did we actually want to come here? Was it necessary to go so far? And there may be forces that may try to pull Sweden back in the other direction. And the jury is out on what will happen.
I was going to say, is this going to push people to reverse the course, or will it push them into the arms of the far right?
Well, it seems to me that's the real question going forward. I mean, does this lead to a rethinking of the reforms and maybe a pullback on some of the reforms, that interpretation of the riots? Or does it just lead to political polarization, where some people say, well, these things haven't gone far enough, or possibly we've allowed too many immigrants into the society, or whatever? Or does it lead to folks on the left saying, no, we need to return to the system that seemed to work before? And I think the underlying issue is that Sweden has changed forever, not just because of the riots. Sweden has changed demographically. The world has changed economically and globally. There's no going back. And the question is, as Sweden moves forward, do you see the kind of growing political polarization in Sweden that we now see in a number of other European countries, which it seems to me could be the consequence, one of the long-term consequences of the euro crisis that we will have to deal with the consequences of for many, many years in terms of elections and political parties that emerge. We see this already
that are
in
more
Hungary.
Anti-establishment and populist. We're
Yes.
going to pick up on that point when we come back. You're watching the France 24 debate.